Welcome to the GR2 Modifiers tutorial. You already know about the concept of a remote controller. For example, you can control a component's parameter with the guitar rig foot pedal. The modifier modules included with GR2 take the concept of real-time parameter value modification to another level, since they can modify multiple parameters simultaneously and tailor the amount of modulation to each parameter. Once you insert a modifier into the rack, you can assign its control signal to almost any component parameter. There are two ways to do this. The simplest is to just click on the modifier's Assign button and drag it on top of the parameter you want to modify. A hand cursor will confirm the parameter is eligible for modifier control. You'll immediately see a half-transparent additional pointer at the wah-wah pedal. It shows the changes of the modulation signal. The second method is ideal if you have a lot of components inserted in the rack and the parameter you want to control is located far from the modifier component. Right-click on the parameter you want to assign. Place the cursor over Modifiers. Move the desired modulator slider to either add the modulation signal to the parameter value or subtract the modulation from the parameter value. Several modulation sources are available even with no modifier modules inserted into the rack. These are input trigger. This generates a constant level modulation signal based on a note's initial input transient. When you play a note, the level goes to full on. Stop the note and the level returns to full off. The rig control switches. Each of these produces a signal that alternates between full off and full on. The rig control pedal generates a signal that varies according to the pedal position. With the modulation matrix, you can control multiple parameters with one pedal. In addition, each modifier lists its target parameters. These also have level controls that are the same as the parameter level controls. This is a convenient way of seeing all the targets being fed from a particular modifier. Finally, note the blue meter above the target's drop-down menu. This gives a visual representation of the modulation signal. The standard value with a drag-and-drop assignment is set to 50%. The higher the setting, the stronger the wah-wah effect. If you set a negative value, the effect on the wah-wah pedal will be reversed. In other words, if you have a negative amplitude on the blue modulation signal, you get a positive effect on the wah-wah pedal. LFO stands for Low Frequency Oscillator, a periodic waveform that occurs at a subsonic rate. Rate sets the LFO frequency. The frequency can also sync to tempo. It synchronizes the LFO rate to a rhythmic value based on guitar rig's metronome tempo, or, if you are using it as a plugin, the master tempo of your host sequencer. You can choose from several different LFO waveforms: sine, triangle, square, or saw. With the random waveform, you can achieve random effects. Polarity flips the waveform's polarity. Trigger restarts the LFO from a specific point as determined by the start phase control. Start phase sets the restart point of the modulation signal. To auto-trigger the LFO so that it restarts when you hit a note, click on the small rectangle above the trigger button so that it turns blue. Here are some examples of use. If you load two LFOs into the rack, you could easily make two opposite directional signals with the polarity button. If you want to modulate two targets in opposite directions using the same waveform at the same rate, you could also achieve this effect by using one LFO. Just set a positive modulation amount on one target and a negative amount on the other target. Here are some sound examples with LFOs. The input level modifier generates a control signal based on the guitar rig 2 input level. This is commonly called an envelope follower. An envelope follower creates an envelope based on the input level. This envelope can be used to control another parameter. Contrary to an LFO, the input level modifier changes with the input signal. Envelope followers are often used for controlling filters. If you use the input level modifier to modulate the filter's cutoff, then the filter will open with louder signals and close as the signal decays. Here are the explanations of the individual parameters. Volume adjusts the overall control signal output. This affects the level of the signal feeding all assigned parameters. Offset varies the control signal's baseline. For example, normally the control signal covers a range from -1 to +1 with 0 as the midpoint. When offset is at minimum, the baseline is -1. When offset is at maximum, the baseline is 0. Attack adds a glide time between when the control signal receives an input change and when the control signal reaches that actual value. Sometimes, too abrupt an attack can create a pop when the control signal first kicks in. Increasing attack can soften this effect. Decay causes the control signal to fall back to its initial setting in the absence of an input signal. Here's an example of use. Set some attack and decay time to create a spongier response and control chorus or ensemble speed or rate. This varies the rate so it doesn't sound quite so regular. Note that you can apply the modifier signal to the modifier's parameters or parameters in other modifiers. For example, you can assign input level to the input level attack control. Stronger input signals increase the attack time. If you really want to drive your audience crazy, apply the input level signal to the pitch pedal's pedal parameter. Here are some other examples with the input level modifier. With the other modifiers, we could only change the modulation signal's amount. With the multi-step envelope, you can generate an arbitrary control shape of the modulation signal over a period of time. To add a breakpoint, right-click anywhere along the envelope curve where you want a breakpoint to appear. To remove a breakpoint, right-click on it. Moving the fixed breakpoints up or down changes the levels, and left or right changes the time. Dragging the small circle between the breakpoints can change the line's shape between the breakpoints from concave to straight to convex. Note that the first and last breakpoints move up and down together because the envelope always starts from where it ended. In the left corner on top of the graphic display, you find a mode option. Mode gives you two possibilities, slide and fixed. In slide mode, if you move a breakpoint left or right, the envelope to the right of the breakpoint moves at the same time to maintain the same times and levels past the breakpoint being edited. In fixed mode, the total envelope time doesn't change. If the envelope extends past the window's visible range, you can change the ruler range and zoom in on the envelope. For more precise adjustments, click on the plus symbol in the lower right. To zoom out, click on the minus symbol. Click on the ruler and drag to the left or right to see a different range of the ruler. Double-click on the ruler to fit the envelope exactly within the visible part of the ruler. Trigger starts the envelope from its beginning. To auto-trigger the envelope so that it starts when you hit a note, click on the small rectangle above the trigger button so that it turns blue. This enables auto-trigger. When release is not active, a trigger of any duration causes the envelope to play through all the way to the end. When it's active, the envelope will proceed through its stages as long as a trigger signal is present. If the trigger signal is not present, the envelope jumps immediately to the third breakpoint from the left and continues from there. If you have a multi-step envelope containing more than the fixed breakpoints, you can enable loop. When enabled, it repeats the curve between the two loop points. Enabling sync superimposes a grid on the envelope display that corresponds to rhythmic values. Breakpoints can be snapped to this grid. Here are some sound examples. The step sequencer generates up to 16 sequential trigger signals, which can have rhythmic values of quarter notes to 30-second notes. To turn on a step so that it provides a trigger, click on the desired step. It turns from gray to blue to indicate that it's producing a trigger. Resolution sets the rhythmic value of each of the 16 steps. Enable legato to tie adjacent steps to each other. This creates longer steps. Step length determines the number of steps. The analog sequencer also generates up to 16 sequential control signals. The number of the single steps can be set with step length. The analog sequencer differs from the step sequencer in that you can change the value of each step. A step is turned on as soon as its position differs from the initial 0 position in the middle. Resolution sets the rhythmic value of each of the 16 steps. With the slide parameter, you can adjust glissando, the continuous sliding from one value of a step to the next. Here are some examples.